Welcome to Unbound, the podcast with Beth Curry, author, storyteller, and survivor. This is where books meet real life, where Beth reads chapters from her work and breaks free from the traditional audiobook format, diving deeper into the personal experiences, lessons, and liberation behind every page. Nothing is off limits. Let's get unbound.
Hi, welcome back to Season 3 of Unbound, The Other Side of Quiet. Today I'm going to share a chapter of my life marked by grief and broken relationships and the long, messy journey towards healing. I was lost, I was angry, and I was trying to survive while carrying this grief that threatened to crush me. In the middle of it all, one person stayed constant, Nate. This chapter is about navigating love, loss, and learning that healing doesn't happen in a straight line. It's chapter 12 in the book, Trying to Move Forward. By late 1994, I'd hit what therapists like to call rock bottom, though at the time I just called it Thursday. I was living at home, weighing more than I ever had in my life, cycling through meaningless sexual encounters that left me feeling emptier than before, and carrying a grief so heavy it felt like it might crush me if I stood still too long. My parents were walking on eggshells around me, clearly desperate to help, but not knowing how. My friends had mostly given up trying to include me in things after months of canceled plans and unanswered calls. But Nate was a different story. There was a weekend in August that summer, Woodstock 94 weekend. One of our friends' parents had this huge property with a pool and set up the whole thing so we could watch the concert all weekend. Everyone was there, music blasting, people swimming, the kind of carefree summer gathering that felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. And I was having fun. Actually having fun, laughing with friends and floating in the pool, letting myself feel something other than grief for a few hours. Then Nate showed up. I saw him walk into the yard, saw him scanning the crowd, and I panicked. I grabbed my stuff and left through the side gate before he could spot me. I couldn't handle seeing him there, or the way his presence would change everything. I just couldn't handle feeling the weight of what we'd lost in the middle of all that lightness. He never saw me. He never knew I'd been there, having fun without him, running away the moment he arrived. It was cowardly, but that's what I'd become. Someone who ran from the person who loved her most. A few months after that devastating fight in my kitchen, after I'd pushed him away with all the cruelty I could muster, and a month after I dodged him at the Woodstock party, my grandpa died, and Nate reached out. Not to get back together, not to try to fix what I'd broken, but just to check on me. I was sitting on my bedroom floor when the phone rang. "Hello?" I said, my voice hoarse from crying. "Beth." Just my name, but I knew the voice immediately. Nate. I should have hung up after what I'd said to him, after the cruelty I'd used to push him away. I had no right to his comfort. He said he heard about my grandpa and asked, "How can I help?" "How did you know?" I asked instead. "I saw the obituary," he said. "I thought it was right to call you." I realized then that Nate was still the person I needed when things fell apart. "I'm so sorry about your grandpa," he said. "I know how much he meant to you. How is your dad?" And just like that, I was crying again. Not just for my grandpa, but for everything. For Kier, for what Nate and I had lost, for the person I used to be who could accept comfort without feeling like she was taking something she didn't deserve. "I'm still here," Nate said into my silence. "I'm not going anywhere. When you're ready to be friends again, I'll be here." Not if you're ready, when. Like he knew something I didn't yet know. That eventually I'd find my own way back to letting him love me, even if only as a friend. And somehow, against all logic, we'd managed to rebuild something. Not the relationship we had before, that felt too fragile, too loaded with grief and guilt for me to handle, but a friendship. Complicated, careful, sometimes painful, but real. Nate was still in medical school, throwing himself into that with the kind of focus that told me he was using work to heal, just like I was using chaos to avoid healing. We'd talk sometimes about his classes, about what he was learning, about his plans for the future. Sometimes he'd tell me about the women he was dating, not to hurt me, but because that's what friends do. They share their lives. And I'd listen and smile and offer advice, all while feeling like someone was slowly tearing my heart out. One woman lasted 2 months. She was a nurse, kind and uncomplicated, and exactly the kind of person Nate deserved. I hated her irrationally, not because she was bad for him, but because she wasn't me. She wants me to meet her parents, he told me over coffee one day, and I watched him try to seem excited about it. That's great, I lied. Yeah, he said, but he didn't sound convinced. They broke up 2 weeks later. I never asked why, but I wondered if he compared her to what we'd had and found it lacking the same way I did with everyone else. We'd meet for coffee occasionally, always in public places where the ghosts of who we'd been together felt less overwhelming. Sometimes those meetings stayed purely friendly, updates on our lives, memories that didn't hurt too much to share, the comfortable rhythm of two people who'd known each other when they were different people. Other times, the pull between us would become too strong to ignore. A lingering touch when he'd walk me to my car, a kiss that was more intimate or lasted longer than a friend's kiss, moments when we'd both remember what it felt like to love each other before trauma taught us to be afraid of love. Like the night we ran into each other at a bar. I was there with friends, trying to pretend I was having fun. He was there with classmates from med school, trying to do the same. Our eyes met across the room, and suddenly it felt like everyone else disappeared. We ended up in his car in the parking lot, making out like teenagers, hands everywhere, both of us breathing hard and desperate and trying to find our way back to each other through touch. Come home with me, he whispered against my neck. And I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But then I saw the elephant onesie in my mind, the one still in a shoebox in my closet, and panic flooded through me. I can't, I said, pulling away. I'm sorry, I can't. The hurt in his eyes nearly killed me, but I got out of the car anyway and went back inside to my friends, leaving him alone in the parking lot. This was our pattern: get close, panic, retreat, over and over until neither of us knew how to be with each other without the cycle. But there were other times too. Times when I didn't retreat, times when we ended up in his bed or somewhere else, when the physical connection became too overwhelming to resist. And that's when I understood the real difference. With other men, the ones whose names I've mostly forgotten, sex was completely disconnected, meaningless. I'd float above my body watching it happen to someone else, feeling nothing, existing somewhere outside myself while they used me for whatever they needed. With Nate, I couldn't dissociate. I was present, painfully, intensely present. Every touch meant something, every moment mattered, and that terrified me more than anything else. Because again, I reminded myself, if it mattered, that meant he mattered. And if he mattered, I could destroy him. And he deserved so much better than being destroyed by someone as broken as me. So even when we were together physically, even when we were as close as two people could be, part of me was already planning my retreat, already building the walls that would keep him safe from me. But I couldn't sustain it. Every time we got close to something real again, every time it started to feel like we might be able to find our way back to each other, the guilt would kick in and I'd retreat. Being with Nate meant remembering Kier, and remembering Kier meant remembering that I'd failed to protect him, and remembering that failure meant remembering that I was toxic to the people I loved most. These emotional thoughts circled on repeat constantly. So I'd pull back, and Nate would let me, and we'd return to the safer territory of friendship until the next time the pull became too strong to resist. I could see what it was doing to him, this push and pull, this constant hope followed by disappointment. He was trying to move on, trying to build a life that didn't revolve around waiting for me to heal enough to love him back. But he couldn't seem to let go completely, and I couldn't seem to let him go completely either. We were stuck in this liminal space between friendship and love, between past and future, between what we'd been and what we might become if I could ever figure out how to stop destroying everything good in my life. It was chaos. It was madness. It was in this context, this strange suspended state between Nate and not Nate, between love and friendship, between healing and self-destruction, that I started trying to date other people. Really date, not just let them use me and hurt me. Not because I was over Nate. I wasn't sure I'd ever be over Nate. But because I was tired. Bone deep, soul-crushing tired of being miserable all the time. Tired of hating myself, tired of punishing myself, tired of living like a ghost in my own life. I thought maybe if I could find someone else to love me, someone who didn't know about my failures, someone who couldn't see Kier's absence in my eyes every time they looked at me, maybe I could learn to feel human again. Maybe I could practice being the kind of person who deserved love with someone who didn't know all the reasons I didn't deserve it. It was flawed logic, but it was the best I could do at the time. The first guy was Corey, someone I met at a party thrown by a friend of a friend. He was nice enough, funny, decent-looking, employed, the kind of person my parents would approve of if I ever brought him home. He didn't know about Brandon or about Kier or about the way trauma had rewired my brain to expect disaster around every corner. To him, I was just Beth. A little quiet maybe, a little sad sometimes, but nothing that couldn't be fixed with enough patience and affection. We went out a few times. He was kind to me in ways I wasn't used to, gentle in ways that should have felt healing, but instead felt foreign and uncomfortable. When he told me he thought he loved me, I felt nothing. When he talked about our future together, I felt trapped. When he touched me, I felt like I was performing a role in a play I'd never auditioned for. I ended it with him one night in his car, sitting outside my parents' house, trying to explain why I couldn't be what he needed me to be. "It's not you," I said, and meant it. "It's me. I'm not ready for this." He was hurt and confused, and I didn't blame him. From his perspective, we'd been building something real together. From my perspective, I'd been playing house with someone while my heart was still broken in pieces on the floor of a hospital room. "Is there someone else?" he asked. I thought about Nate, about the complicated routine we'd been playing out for months, about the way he still looked at me like I was worth saving. "It's complicated," I said. And it was. Everything about my life was complicated. After Corey came Dave, then Rob, Steve, Chris, and a string of other decent men whose names I've mostly forgotten and whose hearts I probably broke without meaning to if they didn't get me first. And some did. I was trying so hard to be normal, to be the kind of woman who could date and fall in love and build a future without constantly looking over her shoulder for the next disaster. But normal felt like a costume that didn't fit right. Every relationship felt like I was playing a character. The girlfriend, the partner, the woman who'd moved on from her past and was ready for love. The problem was that I hadn't moved on. I was dragging my past behind me like a chain, and it affected everything. I'd panic if someone touched me unexpectedly. I'd sabotage things just when they started to get serious, picking fights or withdrawing or finding reasons why it wouldn't work out. And through it all, Nate remained a constant presence in my life, not demanding anything from me, not pressuring me to choose him over the other guys I was dating, but there. Always there when I needed someone who understood why I woke up screaming sometimes, why certain smells made me panic, why I couldn't talk about babies or pregnancy without falling apart. The other men I dated were good people, but they were trying to love someone who didn't really exist anymore. They were trying to love the version of me that might have been if trauma hadn't carved me into something different. Nate was trying to love the version of me that actually existed, damaged, complicated, carrying grief like a second skin. And that difference mattered more than I wanted to admit. By 1995, I'd settled into a pattern that felt sustainable, if not exactly healthy. I'd date someone for a few weeks, maybe a couple of months, enjoy the distraction and the validation, then end things when they started wanting more than I could give. Sometimes, too, the guys were there for the wrong reasons, and they'd end up burning me first. I'd have occasional romantic or sweet moments with Nate that reminded me what real connection felt like, then retreat back into friendship when the intensity became too much. I was functioning, which felt like progress, even if it wasn't exactly thriving. I'd started therapy, finally, with a woman who specialized in trauma and who didn't try to rush me through my grief or convince me that I should be over it by now. She was patient in ways that felt absolutely revolutionary to me. She didn't try to fix me or cure me or make me into someone different. She just helped me understand why my brain worked the way it did, why my body responded to the world the way it did, why healing was so much more complicated than just deciding to feel better. Trauma isn't something you get over, she told me during one of our early sessions. It's something you learn to carry differently. That reframing changed everything for me. I'd been treating my symptoms like evidence of my failure to heal properly, like proof that I was broken beyond repair. But she helped me see them as evidence that I'd survived something devastating, that my brain and body were doing exactly what they were supposed to do in response to overwhelming experiences. "You're not broken," she'd remind me when I'd spiral into self-hatred. "You're adapted. The question isn't how to stop being traumatized. The question is how to live a full life while carrying trauma." The real breakthrough came in a session about 6 months in. I was talking about Nate, about how I couldn't figure out how to let him go or let him back in. "What are you afraid would happen if you let yourself love him again?" my therapist asked. "He'll get hurt again," I said automatically. "Everyone I love gets hurt." Has Nate been hurt more by being in your life or by being pushed out of it? The question stopped me cold. I thought about the look on his face in that parking lot, the voicemails I deleted, the way he looked at that box of cereal in the grocery store like it was a memorial to something we'd lost. "I don't know," I whispered. "Maybe," she said gently, "the way you're trying to protect him is actually just another form of self-punishment. Maybe you're not protecting Nate from you. Maybe you're protecting yourself from the risk of being happy again." I cried for the rest of that session because I knew she was right. Slowly, very slowly, I started to believe that might be possible. It was in this context, therapy, casual dating, complicated friendship with Nate, that 1996 became a turning point. I don't know what shifted exactly. Maybe it was the accumulation of months of therapy helping me understand myself better. Maybe it was getting tired of the endless cycle of dating people I couldn't really connect with. Maybe it was watching Nate graduate from medical school and realizing that life was moving forward whether I was ready or not. But something in me started to soften toward the possibility of real love again. Not so much the performative love I'd been trying to create with other people, but the messy, complicated, grief-tinged love that Nate and I had been spinning around for 2 years. We started spending more time together. Real time, not just coffee dates or careful public meetings, but hours at his apartment talking about everything or nothing, watching movies, cooking dinner together like we used to before everything went wrong. The physical intimacy continued gradually, holding hands while we watched TV, falling asleep together on his couch, kisses that lingered, and more. And for the first time since Keir died, I started to let myself imagine a future that included love again. "I miss this," Nate said one night as we lay together on his bed, not having sex, but not exactly not having sex either, just holding each other in that space between friendship and something more. "Miss what?" I asked, though I knew what he meant. "Us," he said simply. "I miss us." I missed us too, desperately, but missing something and being ready for it again weren't the same thing. "I don't know if I can be what you need me to be," I told him honestly. "I'm not asking you to be anything other than who you are," he said. "I'm just asking you to let me love who you are." We talked that night about trying again, really trying. Not just the careful friendship we'd been maintaining, but a real relationship. He was finishing his residency stuff, I was getting healthier in therapy. Maybe we'd both healed enough to try building something new on the foundation of what we'd shared before. It felt possible in a way it hadn't felt possible in years. We spent so much time talking about it, planning it, imagining what it might look like to be together again without the weight of fresh grief crushing everything we tried to build. But 1996 became the year that tested whether we could really hold each other through tragedy again. Nate's mother had been fighting cancer for about a year. We'd watched her decline slowly. The treatments, the hope, the setbacks, the quiet acceptance that came near the end. When she died in April, it felt both sudden and inevitable at the same time. I was there through all of it, through the long year of watching her fight, through the funeral, through the awful logistics of death, through the nights when he couldn't sleep because grief kept finding new ways to ambush him. I held him the way he'd once held me, and for the first time since Keir died, I felt like maybe I could be strong enough for someone else's pain. We were closer than we'd been in years. The shared grief, not just for Keir anymore, but for his mother too, created a bond that felt unbreakable. And then September came, and his father died too. Both parents, gone within months of each other. Nate was suddenly an orphan of sorts at only 24, finishing residency nonsense while planning his second funeral of the year. I don't think I've ever seen anyone more shattered, and I don't think I'd ever been more present for someone else's pain. I loved him through it, fiercely, completely, in ways that felt like I was finally becoming the person I'd always wanted to be. Someone who could show up, someone who could hold space for grief without running from it. We supported each other through that impossible year in ways that made me believe we really could build a life together. That maybe all the pain we'd both survived had prepared us to hold each other through anything. By the time October rolled around, we weren't just planning a future together. We were living it. He needed me. I was there. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was doing something right. Which is why what made what came next so much worse. By early 1995, before that impossible year began, Nate and I had already fallen into a fragile rhythm again. We spent weekends at his apartment like we used to before everything went wrong. He'd cook, he'd gotten way better at it, and I'd sit on the counter talking about therapy, about the things I was learning, about the ways I was trying to heal. I was nannying for a single mom just around the corner from Nate's, and sometimes during his free time, he'd meet me and the little boy I cared for at the park or the mall, and we'd hang out. One Saturday, we went to our spot at the lake, the same bench where we'd sat before he left for Ohio, before I got pregnant, before everything shattered. We looked out at the same water and talked about whether it was possible to start over, or if we'd always be carrying what we'd lost. I don't want to pretend Kier didn't exist, Nate said. If we do this, if we try again, I don't want it to be built on forgetting him. I don't think I could forget him if I tried, I said. Good, he said, taking my hand. Neither could I. It felt like we were finally on the same page, ready to build something new that acknowledged our past instead of running from it. Through 1995 and into 1996, that cautious rebuilding deepened. We talked about taking things slow, about being patient with each other and creating something new instead of trying to resurrect what we'd lost. We'd even talk about marriage and children, about the life we might build together if we could learn to love each other without the ghosts of our past making it impossible. For the first time since New Year's Eve, 1993, I felt hopeful about the future. But October 1996 would test everything. I had met a guy named Brian, and he called randomly just after my birthday. I figured I would just talk to him on the phone and see if we had anything in common. I almost didn't answer the call. I was practically back together with Nate, after all. We'd spent the entire summer planning our future. We'd talked about marriage again, about children, about how we'd honor Kier's memory and a life we'd build together. But something made me pick up anyway. Curiosity, maybe, or the part of me that wasn't quite ready to close the door on other possibilities. The conversation lasted 2 hours. 2 hours of easy laughter, of discovering that we had the same sense of humor, the same taste in movies, the same way of looking at the world. He was funny in a way that caught me off guard, naturally witty, the kind of person who could find humor in everyday situations without being mean-spirited about it. He was easy to talk to in a way I hadn't experienced with someone new in years. There was no awkwardness, no careful navigation of topics that might be too intense. The conversation just flowed like we'd known each other much longer than we had. By the time we hung up, we'd made plans to meet in person the following weekend. I should have called Nate, should have told him I'd just had a 2-hour conversation with another guy. Should have been honest about the fact that something had shifted, that I was curious about someone new, in a way I hadn't been curious about anyone in years. But I didn't call Nate that night. That should have been my first clue that I was already choosing Brian, even before I'd met up with him. When we finally met in person on Halloween weekend, everything I'd felt during that phone call was amplified. He didn't know about Brandon. He didn't know about Kier. He didn't know about the complicated history I had with Nate or the ways trauma had rewired my brain. To him, I was just Beth. Not Beth who lost a baby, or Beth who survived abuse, or Beth who was too broken to love. Just Beth. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was performing normalcy. I felt like maybe, with him, normalcy might actually be possible. I didn't call Nate that week to tell him I was ready. I didn't know it yet, but I'd just met the person who would change everything. For weeks, I tried to ignore what was happening. I'd see Brian and feel that easy, uncomplicated connection, then I'd see Nate and feel the weight of our history, the depth of what we'd shared, the way he knew every broken piece of me. Part of me thought I should choose Nate. We'd been through so much together. We shared a child, even if that child was only alive in our memories. We'd loved each other when we were different people, and somehow found our way back to each other. Choosing someone else felt like betrayal, like I was abandoning Kier all over again by choosing a future that didn't include his father. But the other part of me, the part that was exhausted from carrying so much grief and guilt, wanted the lightness that Brian offered. I wanted a relationship that wasn't built on the foundation of the shared trauma between Nate and I. I wanted to find out who I could be with someone who didn't know all the reasons I was so fucking damaged. I didn't know yet how to tell Nate. Didn't know how to explain that after everything we'd survived together, after all the plans we'd made that summer, I was choosing someone else. I just knew that something had shifted and there was no shifting it back. Someone who would change the entire trajectory of my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. Someone who would make me realize that sometimes the love you think you want isn't the love you actually need. Someone who would become my husband and the father of my child and the person I'd build my actual life with. I had no idea that day when I first saw him that I was looking at my future. I had no idea that everything I'd been planning with Nate was about to become irrelevant. All I knew was that suddenly, for the first time in years, I felt curious about someone new. And curiosity, I was about to learn, was a much more powerful force than I'd ever imagined. What's actually true? Dating while healing from trauma is like trying to build a house while the foundation is still settling. You're trying to connect with people while your nervous system is still convinced that connection equals danger. You're trying to be vulnerable while your survival instincts are screaming at you to stay protected. The relationships that don't work aren't failing because you're broken. They're failing because you're trying to love and be loved while parts of you are still learning that love can be safe. Some people can love you through your healing process, and some can't. Neither response makes them bad people. It just makes them human. Your healing doesn't have to be complete for you to be worthy of love, but it does affect your capacity to receive and sustain love in healthy ways. What patterns do you notice in your relationships? How does your trauma history show up in the way you connect with others? Permission slip. I am allowed to date while I'm healing. I am allowed to end relationships that don't feel right, even with good people. I'm allowed to take breaks from dating to focus on myself. I'm allowed to have standards and boundaries, even while I'm working on my own issues. You don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love, but you do have to be honest about where you are in your healing. This week, be honest with someone about what you need in relationships right now. Practice asking for what serves your healing instead of what you think they want to hear. So, what hits me hardest when I look back on this chapter isn't any single relationship. It's the pattern, that constant push and pull, wanting love so badly and almost hurt to breathe, and then kind of panicking the moment it got close enough to matter. I see now how clearly trauma shaped the way I loved back then. With Nate, especially, I wanted him near me, but not too near. And I wanted his comfort, but not the responsibility of being someone who could hurt him again. I told myself that I was protecting him when really I was just terrified of what would happen if I let myself want happiness again and then lost it. Because when you've already lost something so sacred, your nervous system starts to believe that love is a setup, if that makes sense. That if you let yourself feel deeply, something terrible is going to follow. So you just kind of hover, you retreat and you test and you disappear. And then you wonder why relationships feel so chaotic. Being with Nate showed me something I didn't understand at the time. Trauma doesn't just change who you are, it changes how present you can be. With other men, I could disappear inside myself. I'd float, I would perform, and I would get through it. But with Nate, I couldn't do that. I was present. I was there for every second of it, every touch, every look, every memory of what we'd lost together. And that level of presence was overwhelming and terrifying. Dating while healing from trauma felt like trying to convince myself and basically everyone else in the world that I was fine. And I wasn't. I was kind of wearing normal, like a costume that never quite fit, smiling when I felt empty, saying yes when my body was screaming no, ending things, not because people were bad, but because I couldn't show up fully without falling apart. And yet I kept trying, not because I was healed or desperate, but because it was human, because grief is lonely and guilt is heavy. And at some point surviving isn't enough, you want to feel alive again. One thing that I want to say clearly here, it took me a while to realize this. Curiosity is not betrayal. I judged myself so harshly for being curious about someone new while still loving Nate. The curiosity was the first sign that something in me was waking back up, that my world was getting bigger instead of smaller, that I wasn't just surviving my grief. I was slowly, awkwardly inching toward a possible future, And another truth I learned the hard way, shared trauma can bond people powerfully, but it can also kind of trap them. Nate and I loved each other deeply. We always will. But at the time, we were also carrying the same loss and the same ghosts and the same memories that kept pulling us backward, even as we tried to move forward. Love alone doesn't always mean timing, readiness, and capacity to line up. Healing taught me that you don't have to be done with your trauma to be worthy of love, but you do need to be honest about where you are, with yourself first, for sure, and then with the people you invite into your life. When I wasn't honest, I hurt people, including myself. When I started telling the truth, even the messy ones, things kind of shifted. So if you're listening to this and thinking, why do I keep repeating the same patterns? Why do I want closeness and fear it at the same time? There's nothing wrong with you. It's a nervous system that kind of learned that love wasn't safe, and it's doing its best to protect you. That's all. Healing also doesn't mean that you suddenly stop being afraid. It means that you notice the fear and you choose presence anyway, when you can. Anyway, it means learning when to lean in and when to say, I'm not there yet, and that's okay. This chapter isn't about choosing the right person. For me, it was about learning how to be honest and how to stay present and how to stop punishing myself for surviving the best way I knew how. You don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love, but you do deserve relationships that can meet you where you actually are and not where you think you should be. And I think that that's the bravest thing that you can do. Trying again anyway, not giving up. Thank you so much for being here. Please make sure to follow me wherever you listen to me, so when new episodes come out, you'll be notified. If you can rate and review, please feel free to do that as well. Remember that all episodes of Unbound are free. If you want to support the production costs, you can find me on Ko-fi, but there's never any obligation. This content will always be free because I believe the barriers to healing should not ever be financial. All the support and contact info is in the show notes. And if you join the Facebook group, we sometimes have further conversation there. I will see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Unbound with Beth Curry. Join the conversation in the Facebook group or visit author.bethcurry.com. Want to support the show? Head to ko-fi.com/Unbound Podcast. Until next time, stay unbound.